Imagine being torn from your mother's arms at age 5, branded like cattle with a red-hot iron, and sold to a Roman master who sees you as nothing more than a piece of property to be used, abused, and discarded when you're no longer profitable. Picture children as young as 3 years old being forced to work 18-hour days in mines, so dangerous that most won't live to see their 10th birthday, while others are trained as gladiators to fight and die for entertainment, or worse, sold into the most horrific forms of exploitation that would make your stomach turn. This isn't some dystopian nightmare. This was the everyday reality for millions of children in the Roman Empire, where childhood was a luxury that slave children were never allowed to experience. What you're about to discover about how Rome systematically destroyed the innocence and humanity of enslaved children will shatter every romanticized image you've ever had about ancient civilization. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what the Romans did to innocent children will make you question everything you thought you knew about the so-called glory of ancient Rome. The slave markets of ancient Rome operated with the cold efficiency of modern livestock auctions, except the merchandise being bought and sold were human children whose entire futures were determined by wealthy Romans examining their teeth, muscles, and potential for various forms of labor and exploitation. These markets weren't hidden away in dark corners of the city. They were prominent commercial centers located in the heart of Rome's most prestigious districts, where respectable citizens would shop for child slaves with the same casual attitude they used when purchasing furniture or household goods. The systematic dehumanization of slave children began the moment they arrived at these markets, as dealers implemented elaborate procedures designed to transform terrified kids into attractive commercial products that would appeal to potential buyers. Children were stripped naked and displayed on raised platforms where buyers could examine every aspect of their bodies, testing their physical strength, checking for diseases or deformities, and evaluating their potential usefulness for different types of work. The psychological trauma of this experience was intentionally ignored, as dealers understood that broken spirits made for more compliant slaves. The age categories that Roman slave dealers used to classify child merchandise reveal the systematic nature of childhood exploitation in ancient Rome, with specific price points and marketing strategies developed for different developmental stages. Infants and toddlers were marketed primarily as future investments, with dealers emphasizing their potential for training and molding according to their master's specific needs. Children aged 5 to 10 were considered prime purchases for household labor, while adolescents were evaluated primarily for their potential in more specialized roles including gladiatorial training, skilled crafts, or sexual exploitation. The marketing techniques employed by slave dealers demonstrate how Roman society had developed sophisticated methods for presenting child exploitation as normal commercial activity, using language and presentation methods that obscured the horror of what was actually taking place. Dealers would highlight children's exotic origins, their potential intelligence, or their physical attractiveness in ways that commodified human qualities and reduced individual personalities to selling points. The most disturbing aspect of this marketing was how dealers would often separate families intentionally, selling children away from their parents to break emotional bonds that might interfere with their new owners. Control. The legal framework surrounding child slave sales reveals how Roman law had created comprehensive systems for treating children as property, while providing extensive protections for buyers who wanted to ensure their human investments would be profitable. Contracts included detailed warranties about children's health, working capacity, and behavioral characteristics, while return policies allowed buyers to exchange slaves who didn't meet their expectations. These legal protections extended only to purchasers. The children themselves had no legal standing or rights whatsoever. The economic factors that drove the child slave trade show how Roman prosperity was literally built on the systematic exploitation of vulnerable children captured from conquered territories throughout the empire. Military campaigns were often planned specifically to acquire large numbers of children who could be sold in Roman markets, with generals calculating the potential profit from enslaved populations when deciding whether to pursue particular conquests. The Roman economy had become so dependent on child slave labor that entire industries would have collapsed without access to this source of cheap, expendable workers. The geographic scale of child slave trading reveals how Rome had created an international network of human trafficking that stretched from Britain to North Africa, with established trade routes, collection centers, and distribution systems that moved thousands of children across the empire every month. Local Roman officials in conquered territories often collaborated with slave dealers to identify and capture the most valuable children, creating systematic programs of kidnapping and human trafficking that operated with governmental approval. Social normalization of child slave trading in Roman culture is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this system, as respectable families would attend slave auctions as social events, bringing their own children to watch and learn how to evaluate human property for future purchases. Roman child slaves were subjected to working conditions so brutal and dangerous that modern labor laws would consider them crimes against humanity. Yet these practices were not only legal, but considered normal and necessary parts of Roman economic life. Children as young as 5 were expected to work from sunrise to sunset, performing tasks that would challenge healthy adults, while facing constant physical punishment for any sign of fatigue, illness, or resistance to their master's demands. The systematic exploitation of child labor was so embedded in Roman culture that wealthy families measured their social status, partly by how many child slaves they owned and how efficiently they could extract labor from these helpless workers. Mining operations that employed thousands of child slaves represent some of the most horrific working conditions in human history, as Roman engineers discovered that children's smaller bodies could access narrow mine shafts and crawl spaces that adult workers couldn't navigate. These child miners worked in complete darkness, breathing toxic fumes and stone dust that would destroy their lungs within months, while facing constant danger from cave-ins, flooding, and explosions that killed more children than any other occupational hazard in the Roman world. The average life expectancy for a child assigned to mining work was less than 2 years from the start of their labor. The agricultural labor that consumed the majority of Rome's child slaves involved brutal physical work that permanently damaged growing bodies and minds, as children were expected to perform the same tasks as adult field workers while receiving minimal food and no medical care. Child slaves worked in all weather conditions, from freezing winter harvests to scorching summer fieldwork that caused heat stroke and dehydration. The seasonal nature of agricultural work meant that child slaves faced periods of intense overwork followed by times when they became economic burdens, leading many masters to rent them out for even more dangerous temporary work or simply abandon them to die, the household labor performed by child slaves in wealthy Roman homes involved a complex system of domestic servitude that required children to be available 24 hours a day for any task their masters demanded. These children were responsible for cleaning, cooking, childcare for their master's legitimate children, and countless other duties that kept them constantly occupied and under surveillance. The psychological manipulation involved in household slavery was particularly cruel, as child slaves were often forced to display gratitude and affection toward the masters who owned and exploited them. The specialized training programs that Roman masters developed for child slaves reveal how the system was designed to extract maximum economic value from young workers while ensuring they would never develop independent skills or identities. Children destined for skilled trades underwent years of intensive training that involved physical punishment for mistakes and complete isolation from other children. The goal was to create specialists who could perform valuable work while remaining psychologically dependent on their masters for survival and identity. The physical punishments used to control child. Slaves were designed to inflict maximum pain while avoiding permanent damage that would reduce the children's economic value, showing how Roman masters had developed sophisticated methods for using violence as a management tool. Beating, burning, and starvation were routine disciplinary measures, while more severe punishments like branding and mutilation were reserved for children who showed signs of rebellion or attempted escape. The constant threat of physical violence created psychological trauma that made effective resistance virtually impossible for most child slaves. The reproductive exploitation of child slaves reveals one of the most disturbing aspects of Roman slavery, as masters understood that slave children would eventually produce the next generation of workers and saw pregnancy and childbirth as economic opportunities rather than human experiences. Female child slaves who showed signs of early physical development were often subjected to forced breeding programs designed to produce valuable offspring, while male children were evaluated for their potential as breeding stock, based on their physical characteristics and work capacity. The gladiatorial schools of ancient Rome operated sophisticated programs for training child slaves to fight and die for public entertainment, creating institutional systems that transformed terrified kids into skilled killers while simultaneously preparing them for almost certain death in the arena. These schools weren't just training facilities, they were psychological manipulation centers designed to break down children's natural reluctance to violence and rebuild them as warriors, who would provide spectacular deaths for the entertainment of Roman crowds. The systematic conversion of innocent children into gladiators represents one of history's most calculated forms of child abuse, carried out on an industrial scale throughout the Roman Empire. The selection process for child gladiators involved evaluating slave children for physical characteristics and psychological traits that would make them effective fighters, with trainers looking for specific combinations of size, agility, aggression, and emotional resilience that could be developed through intensive conditioning programs. Children who showed signs of natural fighting ability or unusual physical strength were separated from other slaves and subjected to specialized evaluation procedures that tested their pain tolerance, reaction speed, and capacity for learning combat techniques. The most promising candidates were often purchased specifically for gladiatorial training, commanding higher prices than slaves destined for other forms of labor. The training regimens implemented in gladiatorial schools subjected child recruits to physical conditioning that would be considered torture by modern standards, involving systematic programs designed to build muscle mass, increase pain tolerance, and develop the reflexes necessary for arena combat. Children were forced to exercise for hours each day while receiving minimal nutrition, creating bodies that were lean, fast, and desperate enough to fight viciously for survival. The physical training was accompanied by psychological conditioning. That involved exposing children to increasing levels of violence until they became desensitized to bloodshed and death. The weapon specialization programs, developed by gladiatorial trainers, created different categories of child fighters, each trained in specific combat styles that would provide variety and entertainment value for arena audiences. Some children were trained as net fighters, learning to use weighted nets and tridents in combat styles that emphasized speed and agility over raw strength. Others were conditioned as heavily armored fighters who would engage in brutal close combat that typically resulted in severe injuries or death for at least one participant. The specialization process began when children were as young as 8 years old and continued until they were ready for arena combat. The psychological manipulation techniques used in gladiatorial schools were designed to create artificial family structures and loyalty bonds that would prevent escape attempts while encouraging fierce competition between child trainees. Trainers would adopt paternal roles toward their students while simultaneously preparing them for death creating complex, emotional relationships that made resistance more difficult. Children were taught to see other gladiator schools as enemies and to take pride in their fighting skills, transforming their natural survival instincts into competitive drives that served their masters' economic interests. The medical care provided to child gladiators reveals how these schools operated as commercial enterprises focused on maximizing profit from their human investments while accepting that most trainees would eventually die in combat. Gladiatorial schools employed skilled physicians who specialized in treating combat injuries and maintaining fighters in peak physical condition. But this medical attention was purely economic rather than humanitarian. Children who suffered injuries that would prevent effective fighting were often discarded or sold to less prestigious venues where they would face even more dangerous opponents. The graduation ceremonies that marked child gladiators' transition from training to actual arena combat were designed to create psychological commitment to their roles, while providing final opportunities for masters to evaluate their investments. These events combined religious rituals, oath-taking ceremonies, and preliminary combat trials that served both as celebration and final examination. Children who successfully completed gladiatorial training understood that they had achieved a form of specialized status within the slave system, but also that their life expectancy was now measured in months rather than years. Content warning. This chapter addresses historical facts about child sexual exploitation in ancient Rome. The content is educational and historically accurate, but deals with disturbing subject matter: the systematic sexual exploitation of child slaves in ancient Rome represents one of the darkest aspects of the empire's treatment of enslaved minors, as Roman law explicitly permitted masters to use slave children for sexual purposes, while providing no protections or legal recourse for victims of abuse. This wasn't considered criminal behavior or moral failing. It was viewed as a natural right of slave ownership that Roman society not only tolerated but actively facilitated through established markets, training programs, and cultural practices that normalized the sexual abuse of children. The commercial infrastructure that supported child sexual exploitation included specialized slave dealers who focused exclusively on providing young victims for wealthy Romans seeking particular physical characteristics or personality traits in their abuse targets. These dealers operated sophisticated evaluation systems that assessed children's potential for sexual exploitation, often examining victims as young as 5 or 6 years old to determine their future value in markets that treated child sexual abuse as a legitimate business opportunity. The prices commanded by child slaves destined for sexual exploitation were often higher than those sold for labor, reflecting the economic demand for this form of abuse. The legal framework surrounding child sexual exploitation reveals how Roman jurisprudence had created comprehensive systems for protecting masters' rights to abuse their slave children, while ensuring that victims had no means of seeking protection or justice. Roman law treated slave children as property that could be used for any purpose their owners desired, including sexual abuse, while simultaneously creating legal penalties for anyone who interfered with a master's use of his human property. The legal system provided detailed regulations about the buying and selling of child slaves for sexual purposes, while offering no protections whatsoever for the children being victimized. The cultural normalization of child sexual abuse among Roman elites demonstrates how systematic exploitation had become so embedded in upper-class lifestyle that wealthy Romans openly discussed their abuse of slave children as normal social behavior. Literary works, artistic depictions, and historical accounts from the period show that Roman society had developed elaborate cultural justifications for child sexual abuse, presenting it as natural expression of power relationships rather than criminal victimization of helpless children. This cultural acceptance made resistance or criticism of child sexual abuse virtually impossible within Roman society. The psychological impact of systematic sexual abuse on enslaved children created long-term trauma that affected not only immediate victims but entire generations of slave families who understood that their children faced almost certain sexual exploitation. Historical accounts suggest that many slave parents developed severe depression and anxiety disorders as they watched their children being prepared for sexual abuse, while victims themselves showed symptoms that modern psychology would recognize as complex post-traumatic stress disorder. The intergenerational trauma created by systematic child sexual abuse affected slave communities throughout the Roman Empire. The international scope of child sexual exploitation included established trade networks that moved children specifically selected for sexual abuse across the empire, with certain regions becoming known for producing victims with particular characteristics that appealed to Roman buyers. Military campaigns often included specific objectives for capturing children who could be sold into sexual slavery, while diplomatic relationships sometimes involved the exchange of child victims as gifts between political leaders. The systematic nature of this international trafficking reveals how child sexual exploitation had become integral to Roman foreign policy and military strategy. The medical aspects of child sexual exploitation involved Roman physicians who specialized in treating injuries caused by abuse while helping masters maintain their victims' health and appearance for continued exploitation. These medical professionals developed specialized knowledge about treating trauma in child victims, while simultaneously participating in the system that created their injuries. The medical infrastructure supporting child sexual abuse demonstrates how Roman society had created comprehensive institutional support for systematic victimization of enslaved children. The escape attempts made by enslaved children throughout the Roman Empire reveal both the desperate courage of young people fighting for freedom and the sophisticated systems of surveillance and punishment that Roman society had developed to prevent slave rebellion. Despite facing almost impossible odds, and knowing that capture would result in horrific punishment or death, thousands of child slaves attempted to flee their bondage every year, creating a constant source of anxiety for Roman masters and leading to increasingly brutal deterrent measures designed to terrorize other potential escapees. The planning and execution of escape attempts by child slaves required remarkable intelligence and resourcefulness, as these young people had to overcome constant surveillance, navigate unfamiliar territory, and find ways to survive without resources or legal protection. Many escape attempts were coordinated efforts involving multiple children who would work together to overcome guards, steal supplies, and create diversions that would allow them to flee en masse. The sophistication of some escape plans suggests that even very young slaves were capable of complex strategic thinking when their survival depended on it. The underground networks that developed to assist escaped child slaves reveal how some segments of Roman society rejected the empire's treatment of enslaved minors and were willing to risk severe punishment to help child refugees reach safety. These networks included sympathetic Romans, freed slaves who remembered their own experiences, and members of religious communities who viewed child slavery as morally unacceptable. The existence of these networks demonstrates that even in a society that normalized child exploitation, some individuals maintained moral standards that compelled them to resist the system. The tracking and recapture methods employed by Roman authorities show how the empire had developed systematic approaches to hunting down escaped slave children, using professional slave catchers, trained dogs, and extensive spy networks to locate and return fugitives to their masters. These tracking operations often involved brutal interrogation of suspected accomplices, torture of captured escapees to extract information about other fugitives, and public displays of violence designed to discourage future escape attempts. The efficiency of Roman recapture operations meant that most child escape attempts ended in failure and severe punishment, The punishments imposed on recaptured child slaves were designed to serve multiple purposes: revenge against individuals who had challenged their master's authority, deterrence for other potential escapees, and public demonstration of Roman power over enslaved populations. These punishments included branding with hot irons to permanently mark escapees, severe beatings that often resulted in permanent disability, and crucifixion for children whose escape attempts were considered particularly serious threats to the slave system. The public nature of these punishments was intended to traumatize other slave children and destroy their hope of ever achieving freedom. The psychological impact of witnessing escape punishments created lasting trauma throughout slave communities, as children were often forced to watch the torture and execution of other young people who had attempted to flee. This systematic exposure to extreme violence was designed to create learned helplessness and destroy the psychological resilience necessary for resistance or escape planning. The effectiveness of this psychological warfare is demonstrated by historical accounts showing that most child slaves became increasingly passive and compliant after witnessing punishment of escapees. The legal consequences for Romans who assisted escaped child slaves included severe criminal penalties that could result in loss of citizenship, property confiscation, and even death for individuals convicted of interfering with slave recovery operations. These harsh legal penalties were designed to eliminate potential sources of assistance for escaped children, while demonstrating that Roman society would not tolerate challenges to the slave system. The severity of these penalties reveals how essential child slave labor had become to Roman economic and social structures. The long-term effects of escape attempts on Roman slave management practices included the development of increasingly sophisticated control mechanisms, enhanced surveillance systems, and more brutal punishment protocols that made successful escapes progressively more difficult. These adaptations show how the courage of individual child slaves forced systemic changes in how Roman society managed its enslaved population, though unfortunately, these changes typically made conditions worse for subsequent generations of enslaved children. The psychological damage inflicted on enslaved children in ancient Rome created lasting trauma that affected not only immediate victims, but entire generations of families and communities throughout the empire, leaving scars that persisted long after the individuals involved had died and contributing to cultural patterns of violence and dehumanization that would influence Western civilization for centuries. Modern psychological research into childhood trauma provides frameworks for understanding how the systematic abuse experienced by Roman slave children would have created complex post-traumatic stress disorders, attachment difficulties, and intergenerational trauma that affected entire populations. The documentation of psychological symptoms in historical accounts suggests that Roman slave children displayed behaviors that contemporary psychology would recognize as classic responses to severe childhood trauma, including dissociation, aggressive outbursts, self-harm, and complete emotional withdrawal from their surroundings. These symptoms were not understood or treated by Roman society, which viewed such behaviors as character flaws or defects that required punishment rather than healing. The lack of psychological understanding or treatment meant that traumatized children had no resources for recovery and were often subjected to additional abuse for displaying trauma symptoms. The intergenerational transmission of trauma within slave families created cycles of psychological damage that continued long after the original abuse had ended, as parents who had survived childhood slavery often struggled with their own unresolved trauma while trying to protect their children from similar experiences. Historical accounts describe slave parents who became severely depressed, anxious, or violent as they watched their own children face the same exploitation they had endured, creating family environments where trauma was continuously reinforced. Rather than healed, the cultural normalization of child abuse in Roman society created broader social patterns that extended far beyond the slave population. As Roman citizens who grew up witnessing or participating in the systematic exploitation of enslaved children developed attitudes toward violence and human dignity that influenced their treatment of all vulnerable populations. The acceptance of extreme cruelty toward slave children contributed to Roman cultural patterns that normalized violence against women, foreigners, and political enemies, creating a civilization that was systematically desensitized to human suffering. The influence of Roman slavery practices on subsequent historical periods demonstrates how the systematic dehumanization of children created cultural precedents that would be referenced and replicated by later societies seeking to justify their own exploitation of vulnerable populations. The legal frameworks, economic systems, and social attitudes developed by Rome to support child slavery provided blueprints that would be used by medieval European societies, colonial powers, and modern totalitarian regimes to justify their own systematic abuse of children. The archaeological evidence that documents the lives of Roman slave children provides physical confirmation of the systematic abuse described in historical accounts, including skeletal remains that show evidence of malnutrition, physical abuse, and premature death among enslaved minors. Burial sites, work tools sized for children, and residential remains from slave quarters all provide material evidence of how Roman society had created comprehensive infrastructure to support the exploitation of enslaved children on a massive scale. The modern historical understanding of Roman child slavery has evolved as scholars have begun applying contemporary frameworks about child development, trauma, and human rights to analyze ancient practices that were previously dismissed or romanticized in historical accounts. This new scholarly approach reveals how the systematic abuse of enslaved children was far more damaging and extensive than earlier historians had recognized, forcing a complete reevaluation of Roman civilization and its legacy. The horrific truth about Roman child slavery forces us to confront how one of history's most celebrated civilizations was built on the systematic destruction of childhood innocence and human dignity. Every magnificent Roman building, every piece of literature, every military victory was made possible by the suffering of millions of enslaved children whose names we'll never know, but whose pain echoes through history. If learning about these forgotten victims has opened your eyes to how civilizations can normalize the most horrific forms of abuse, smash that like button, subscribe for more hidden truths about history's darkest chapters, and hit that notification bell, because remembering these children and their suffering is the first step toward ensuring that such systematic cruelty never happens again.